Welcome to part 3 of David's approach to music theory. In this section, we're going to talk about advanced chords. How do you make some of the jazzier stuff? Why are they that way? What are the considerations for what you can and can't do? We're going to talk about 7ths, 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths. We're going to go back and review major 7ths and add 6ths into that. We're going to talk about altering certain tones, that is to say certain decorated chords. And then some of my favorite topics, diminished chords and augmented chords. And end up with, finally, the 7-flat-5 chord, one of the more interesting chords in modern music. Remember that when you have a number after a chord note name like C7 or C6, that number does not refer to the 12 notes of the total scale. It refers to the notes in the octave. So in this case, if I have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C7 means I'm talking about something about the B. And as I said, if it just says C7 by itself, that means it's the flatted 7. The 6th means I'm talking about A. So once again, you start with the root note that's there, and you use its scale, not the complete 12-tone scale. So some of these decorations are easy, like a 6th or a 4. Some of those are very straightforward. But the odd-numbered decorations are a little odd. The 7th is fairly simple, as we've talked about. It's generally the flatted 7th note of the root scale. And it looks like this, 1, 3, 5, flatted 7 note, right? What happens with 9ths and 11ths, and to some degree 13ths, is they build on each other. So a 9th chord is the same as the 7th, but you add the 9th. Now, what do I mean by 9? Well, if you're going from C to shining C, the C is 1, the D is 2, and so on. When you get to the 7, that's B. The 8 is C again. So 1, 8, 16, these are all Cs. So when I say 9, what do I really mean? I mean D. Okay, so 9 is the same as 2 because I'm talking about a note an octave above the root note. The idea of 9 means don't just add a D right in the middle of the chord. No, you want to add that D in the next octave higher. So a full 9th chord is 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and 9. The 11th chord builds on that. You get 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 9, 11. But that's 6 notes, and if you've ever tried to make an 11th chord on the guitar, good luck. So I usually play, and most people play it, as a 4-note chord where there's 1, flat 7, 9, 11 in there. Now, there's some interesting musical theory behind that. I don't want to get into that right now. I'm just talking about the mechanics of making it. 13th chords, once again, you'd have 7 notes, which, of course, is physically impossible on the guitar. So what most people play is 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 13. And once again, the 13, if you look at it, back in the original octave, that's the 6th. Just like the 11th is the 4th from the original octave, and the 9th is the 2. We're talking about stuff that's an octave above. And you can sit and play around with these, but they're really not that hard. And I want to emphasize to people that books of chords are, I think, something to be avoided. You should figure out these chords on your own. Or get a book, find a couple of forms for like an 11th chord, and then ask yourself, why is this an 11th? And take the notes apart and see how it works, and you'll probably figure out better ways to do it for yourself. Okay. Now, we've talked about major 7ths a little bit. The standard 7th chord, that is to say the natural or dominant 7th, is 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Because the 7th chord's not allowed, you typically can't play a C7 in C because it's got a B flat. But if you raise the B to a B natural, you've made a major 7th chord. And that means that you've got the notes C, E, G, B, and they're all in C, and everybody's a happy camper. So we've talked about major 7th and regular 7th. The next most interesting chord in that variety is the C6 chord, which usually means you've raised the 5th of 1, 3, 5 to 1, 3, 6, which is C, E, A. And there's 2 things to note here, because you start finding these relationships. One is that these are the same notes that are in an A minor chord, only inverted. If you took those same 3 notes and played them A, C, E, that's an A minor chord. You play it C, A, E, A, that's a C6. Are you going to be fined or accused of bad musicianship if you play one for the other? Often not. A lot of times players will just choose at certain points in the song to substitute the two because they really are the same notes. In the end, it's all about notes. Welcome back. Now we've talked about all kinds of chord formations, minor sevenths, major sevenths, sevenths. I'm going to demonstrate a little here. Let's take a C chord. Now we play the standard C7, which again, if you look at it in notes, is C, E, B flat, C, or you can play and add that extra E. But notice it's just the triad notes with one more added, that B flat. To make a 9, I have to add really the second, which is D, the second note after C, but in the next octave. So think of C as being 1 or 8. D therefore is 2 or 9. And if I do that, there's the 9. Now I can play a big fat chord that's all 6 strings. But a lot of jazz players would like that chord to have that D at the topmost note, so it sounds like that rather than like that with that fourth at the top. When I want to play an 11th chord, I am a little bit stuck because I've already gotten into the situation where 1, 3, 5 flat 7, 9 is 5 strings if I do it right. That's just a 9th chord. Now with an 11, I've got to add 6 strings. Well, first it doesn't sound very good, and the other problem is that it just doesn't work. So most people will play it by doing a trick. They will play the triad from the chord 1 step or 2 half steps below on the base of the chord. So here's a good example. It's G11. Here's a G. Now here's an F, and here are the middle notes in the F chord, F, A, C. If I play the G as the bass, that's an 11. And that's what a lot of jazz players know, is that really, if you look at it musically, an 11 is a particular chord with the note 2 half steps sharp as its bass. And you can look at a lot of books to figure it out, but there's a bunch of different ways to play the 11. In other words, here's a C11. Okay, I'm playing a B flat chord with a C at the bass. So that's one trick you can do with 11 chord. 13s are relatively easy. The most common one is this, where you play, there's your G7, and then here's my E to make that there. Once again, you just construct it, and I'm playing 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and then 13. And this is a little bit different order. What happens here is 1, flat 7, 3, and the 13 is already an octave higher, because this 3 is an octave higher than the B down here in the bass. I know this sounds complicated, but I treat it as a bag of notes. Take the chords you want to make, whatever it is, in the key. So for example, if it says B flat 9, you take that and you think, what is that? Well, that's going to be B flat, D, G, A flat, C. And then just find good places to play those notes. And that's all there is to it. Here again, when you're trying to learn these things, it's important to get to some ear training. And ear training will let you distinguish between things like sevenths, major seventh, sixth, minor seventh, things like that, even fourths. So I say that a lot of that comes with time, but if you know the theory, you can plug that theory into where your ear needs to have it and say, oh, I'm hearing that. That means it's minor, and I'm hearing something more than just a minor, so it's probably a minor seventh. And then you try it out and you see. You'll make mistakes, but you'll get there a lot faster. There are several kinds of chords that are not so common but not so uncommon, and they just have to do with sticking notes in. Some people call them by different names. I'm going to use the most common names here. If you see C add 2, that means take a C major chord and stick a second right in the middle of the chord, as close to the C as you can. It gives a very ringy effect. I'm going to demonstrate that later. A C sus4, that stands for sustained 4, means that you replace the third in the chord, which is the E, with the F, which is the fourth. Again, this gives you a ringy tone because it's neither major nor minor. Its third is gone. C5 isn't really a chord at all. This is what's known in guitar parlance as a power chord. And people play them because A, they're easy, and B, you can make a lot of mistakes improvising over them that nobody can hear. Very popular in heavy metal for the reason that it sounds very metallic and ringy. And all it is just a fifth interval between C and G. And that's it. And it's technically not a chord, but you'll see it sometimes listed. C add 9 is the same as C add 2, meaning you're going to want to add a D, but it means add the D in the next octave. So what's the difference between C add 9 and C9? Well, the difference is that there's no flat seventh in this one. This is just a C chord with a D on top, like a cherry on a sundae. Now, one of my most favorite subjects is why the number 12 is so important. One of my big reasons is mathematically you can divide it by 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. And we're going to talk about, they all have musical importance, but I'm going to talk about 2, 3, and 4. If you go through the octave and you pick out every fourth note, you'll wind up back at the octave. Or you pick out every third note, you'll wind up back at the octave. This means that it's evenly divisible. And there's two kinds of chords that are constructed this way, diminished chords and augmented chords. I'll talk about why they're called that in a minute. A diminished chord is made by starting on a root note and choosing every third tone as you move up. Once you've gotten 4 notes, you're back to the octave, and you'll see that the pattern starts over again. And this is called a diminished chord. Because 4 times 3 is 12, there's only 3 actually musically distinct diminished chords. The others are simply inversions. So the example is, take C diminished. If I take every 3 frets up, I go C, E flat, F sharp, A. If I start on A, I get A, C, E flat, F sharp, same notes. For this reason, C diminished and A diminished, and for that matter, E flat diminished and F sharp diminished, are all just inversions of each other. And you can call them by any of those names because it's all correct. The reason it's called diminished is because there was a general construction rule that a lot of jazz players followed, which is you take a 7th chord like a C7 and you flatten every note but the root. And if you follow that rule, you'll find that you get C, E flat, F sharp, A. That's just how it is. So it's diminished because you've diminished everything. And as I said, each diminished chord that you make can be called by any of the notes that are in there. So very often in music, when you see a C diminished or an E flat diminished, they're really just telling you what they want to be as the lowest note. And that's a whole other topic and that we don't have time to get into, but it's the same set of chords. Now, an augmented chord is called augmented for the reason that you've augmented the 5th tone. That means you've got 1, 3, sharp 5. And another way to build them, very much like diminished, is you start at a root note and you choose every 4th tone until you reach the octave. This means there's only 4 unique augmented chords. If I do this with C, I get C, E, G sharp, that's the sharp 5, and C augmented has those 3 notes. So these are 3-note chords. A diminished was a 4-note chord, and there's 3 of them. An augmented is a 3-note chord, and there's 4 of them. So E augmented, if you start on E, you get E, G sharp, C. It's the same notes. So if you want to name an augmented chord, you name it any of the notes that are in its structure. Once again, it's 1, 3, sharp 5. The 7 flat 5 chord is interesting because you're dividing the octave immediately in half. Remember, there's 12 half steps or frets in an octave, and 6 is half of 12. And that interval is 1 less than the 5th, which is 7 half steps or 7 frets. It's a flatted 5, which is 6. There's no really good musical relationship that way. That interval doesn't occur in the major scale or the minor scale or anywhere else, but it happens to be very useful for several reasons in jazz. And one of the most interesting things is if you make a 7 flat 5 chord, you construct it like, for example, in C, you'd have C, E, F sharp, B flat. C and E are the 1st and 3rd. F sharp is the flatted G. You call it G flat if you want. And B flat is the flat 7. So the F sharp is the flat 5. B flat is the flat 7. Starting again from F sharp, let's do the same thing. We got F sharp is the 1st. A sharp or B flat is the 3rd. C is the flatted 5th. And E is the flatted 7th. But notice the notes are the same. They're inverted. So 7 flat 5 chords repeat every 6 half steps. And again, this is very important in jazz, but it's something that you can run into and you often see, and it's surprising. You rarely ever see a simple flat 5 chord. It's almost always a 7 flat 5 chord, for the reason that it's got very close relationship to another 7 chord that's exactly 6 half steps away. Okay, thanks. The demonstration is to follow. We're back. I want to talk about some of these simple add-on chords. For example, here is C. And if I want to play C9, it sounds like this. But if I want to play C add 2, the usual way to play it is like this. Where I'm playing C, E, G, D. And that's just a nice little add-on. I can also just lift my middle finger. We see this a lot when guitar instrumentalists play. They love those ringing chords. A sus4 means you add the 4th. So here's a C. The 4th is F. So if I add that, once again you hear that ring? That means you're not getting a 3rd. There's no sense of major or minor in there. So I can play the add 2. I can play the add 2 this way. No major or minor. The sus4, which stands for sustained, by the way. You can play the sustained 4 and there's really no sense of tonality. And then add 9 and add 2 are very similar, but usually they're played the same. You sort of play what sounds good and what's relatively attainable or easy at that time. Now, diminished chords. As I said in the video, in the other section of the video, there's the normal scale. That's the 12. But that's not an even division. That's just a pick. That's 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. What if I divide this thing evenly by 3? Okay, I take those 3 frets, those 3 frets, those 3 frets. What does that sound like? That's a diminished chord. And if you notice, if I started someplace else, if I started on G, there's notes here, E, G, B flat, C sharp, E. If I start on G, I get G, B flat, C sharp, E, G. Same notes. So when I play a diminished chord, every one of its notes is the name of the chord. So this is an E diminished, a B flat diminished, a C diminished, or a G diminished. By convention, whatever it's called, you should try to put that in the bass, because that's usually what the composer intended. So you've heard this kind of thing a lot of times in cartoons. I use it all the time in arrangement. It's so lovely. And there's a whole thing about substituting for sevenths, which is in my book that you can read. Now, augmented chords are similar, except for one thing. Instead of having 3 4-note chords like you had with diminished, you now have 4 3-note chords. Let me repeat that. You've got in diminished, you've got 3, and then you're back home, 4-note chords. With augmented, you've got 4 3-note chords. And they're called augmented because you're taking your C triad and you're raising the G. And you've heard that a lot. That's been in many, many songs. Very many famous songs have done that. And again, because it divides the octave evenly, when I play this chord, it's a C augmented, an E augmented, a G sharp augmented. It's all 3 of those. And then the last one I talk about in here is a flat 5 chord. And flat 5s are interesting, but it's kind of jazzy, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Merely to say that this common flat 5 chord, there's a G7 flat 5, right? It's also a D flat 5. D flat flat 5, excuse me, D flat flat 5. And that's very interesting because it means when you're playing jazzy tunes, you've got another way to come back to the tonic without going through the dominant. You can use a D flat chord to go there. Like here. Those are the same notes as this. You can even hear that they're very similar, just a different inversion. So, what are the take-home messages here? The take-home messages are there's a 12-tone scale that's ubiquitous in Western music that everything is written using. There's a major scale pattern of notes that you pick from that scale. that you pick out of the 12 that repeats for every octave up or down. There are simple rules for building a major chord triad, minor chord triad. There's a C minor. And when you're writing, when you're playing chords, and when you're improvising, your first choice should always be a note in the key. If you do that, you'll sound coherent, you'll sound melodic, you won't hit clunkers, and you can add little extra things as you learn as you go without creating a lot of problems. And an important point to remember is don't play some particular note pattern over some particular chord because it's easy. You've got to ask yourself, does that note pattern fit this chord in this key? Key is king.